The 18th century Venetian mirror reflected only shadows that December morning 1898. In the imperial room of the Beau Rivage Hotel in Geneva, Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie von Wittelsbach observed her reflection with the same surgical intensity with which she examined diamond defects. Her brown hair, which had already touched the floor like a silk waterfall, were now stuck in severe braids that hid the first gray strands. It mediates the circumference of the waist every morning, 50 centimeters, never 1 millimeter more, as if checking out the heartbeat before death. In the hotel windows, the fog of Lake Leman moved slowly, swallowing the contours of the mountains. Inside the room, Elisabeth disappeared from herself, inch per centimeter, breathing, a silent war against the only thing she truly had, her own body. If you feel touched by stories that reveal the shadows behind the brightness, consider subscribing to our channel. Here we explore the lives that the official story preferred to forget, the women who have paid the highest price for perfection, and the secrets that still wisp through the centuries. Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie, born on December 24, 1837 at the Possenhofen Palace, Bavaria, came to the world as a Christmas gift involved in promises she could never fulfill. Daughter of Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria and Princess Ludovica, she grew up between dusty alpine lakes and libraries in a family where eccentricity was inherited as old jewels. His father collected walking circuses and played cithara. His mother sighed for the lost French court. Elisabeth learned to ride before learning to reverence, to swim in icy waters before dominating the imperial protocol. He was a wild girl in a Europe that tamed princesses such as tamed horses, with invisible golden reins and spurs. At the age of 15, in 1853, Elisabeth was summoned to Bad Ischl, not to know Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, but to serve as a gimmick. The original plan was that his older sister Helena would conquer the imperial heart. But Franz Joseph, 23, looked at Elisabeth as a man looks at a miracle that does not understand, dazzled and already planning to possess it. She wore a simple pink dress without jewelry, no gimmicks. Her hair fell loose through her shoulders like dark water. He fell in love not for the princess she was, but for the freedom she still carried in her eyes. The engagement was announced in 3 days. Marriage would take place in less than a year. Elisabeth passed from Bavarian teenager, the future Empress of Austria-Hungary, in the time that leads to a butterfly to die in a collection. During the months preceding the marriage, she learned that imperial love is not feeling but contract, that the Viennese court does not forgive youth or spontaneity, that an empress is a decorative object that must work perfectly, silently, indefinitely. Elisabeth's transformation into Sisi, as she would be known for the rest of her life, revealed the first paradox of her existence. The more loved by the public, the more prisoner she became. The love that Franz Joseph felt for her was possessive as a disease. He wanted her untouched by the world, preserved as a relic, but displayed as a trophy. Elisabeth began to understand that she had been chosen not by who she was, but by perfectly representing everything an empress should be: young, beautiful, silent, and fertile. The marriage took place on April 24, 1854, at the Agostinos Church in Vienna. Elisabeth walked down the hall like a bride walks to the altar, knowing she's a few steps from ceasing to exist as an individual. Her dress, embroidered with silver and diamonds, weighed so much that she needed help to move. The bridal crown was a gold arrest in precious stones that left red marks on its forehead. During the ceremony, she smiled with the accuracy of a mechanical doll, but her eyes were already carrying the vacuum of those who understood that she had just signed her own symbolic death sentence. The honeymoon was a public presentation of 3 weeks. Elisabeth and Franz Joseph traveled the empire on imperial trains, stopping in cities where crowds clustered to see the new empress. She waved from balconies, smiled at receptions, allowed high society ladies to touch her gloves as relics. With each public appearance, Elisabeth felt a part of himself being consumed by the expectations of others. She was worshipped for her beauty, but this worship was a fire that slowly devoured her. Back in Vienna, Elisabeth found that being an empress meant living under constant surveillance. His letters were read, his timetables, his conversations supervised by the rigid Austrian court label. The Archduchess Sophie, Eli's mother, in law knowledge and true strength behind the throne, treated the young empress as a child who needed to be constantly corrected. Sophie decided what Elisabeth should wear, who he should talk to, where he should appear. Elisabeth was an empress who was not allowed to reign over her own life. The first pregnancy arrived rapidly in 1855. Elisabeth gave birth to her daughter, Sophie Friederike, but the child was immediately removed from her arms and handed over to the care of the Sophie Archduchess. Elisabeth could not breastfeed, could not choose her daughter's clothes, could not even decide when she saw her. She had generated an heiress, but had no right to be a mother. The second daughter, Gisela, was born in 1856, following the same forced separation protocol. Elisabeth began to understand that her body did not belong to her. It was an imperial instrument to produce heirs. It was during these early years of marriage that Elisabeth developed her obsession with physical beauty. If you could not control your life, You would at least control your appearance. She began to spend daily hours taking care of her hair, which grew up to the floor. Elisabeth's hair ritual lasted 3 hours and required the full attention of her Hungarian hairdresser, Franziska Fejfalik. Any wire that fell during the process was carefully collected and presented to the Empress so that she knew exactly how much of her was losing every day. In 1858, Elisabeth finally gave birth to the imperial heir, Rudolf, but not even the motherhood of a future emperor guaranteed her autonomy. Rudolf, like the sisters before him, was immediately delivered to the care of the court. Elisabeth was becoming a stranger in her own family, a visitor in her own life. It was then that she discovered the only way of power no one could take her, the absolute control over her own body. Elisabeth's diet began as an eccentricity of the court, but quickly turned into something much darker. She started eating only raw meats, eggs, and milk when she ate. Many times, he spent whole days consuming only crystallized violets or lemon juice. Its naturally thin waist began to decrease alarmingly. She has a sin counted centimeters and considered any expansion an unacceptable moral failure. Exercise has become another obsession. Elisabeth installed gymnastics bars in her imperial quarters and spent hours doing exercises that left her horrified ladies. She walked between 6 and 8 hours a day, regardless of the weather. At the age of 40, he could still make stunts who challenged women from 20. But this physical force hid a deep weakness. Elisabeth was literally disappearing from herself, using body discipline as a form of slow and elegant suicide. The obsession with exercises extended to riding. Elisabeth became one of Europe's most skilled Amazons, setting up horses that others considered impossible to tame. She jumped obstacles that experienced men avoided, galloping for hours at dangerous speeds. Riding was her only form of literal escape. On a horse, she could leave Vienna, leave the protocol, leave the golden arrest of her imperial life. But even these escapes were temporary. Elisabeth always needed to go back to the court, to the husband who loved her as she loves a precious property, to the life she had not chosen. Elisabeth's beauty became almost supernatural, but it was the beauty of someone who was consuming from the inside out. She wore raw veal masks on her face at night, bathed in milk and honey, applied cutters of cutters to keep her skin youth. Her hair was washed with brandy and eggs. She slept with ointment, soaked pellet gloves to keep her hands soft. Elisabeth was becoming a work of living art, but works of art do not breathe, do not feel, do not live. The 1860s marked the darkest period of Elisabeth's life. His mental health began to deteriorate visibly. She developed a persistent cough that doctors couldn't heal. It was as if her body was rejecting the act of breathing. Elisabeth was constantly traveling, seeking climates that could relieve her symptoms, but actually running away from a life that had become unbearable. Madeira, Corfu, England, Hungary. Elisabeth roamed Europe as a lost soul in search of a home that did not exist. She traveled with a minimal entourage, avoiding official protocols, refusing to play the role of empress. Franz Joseph begged her to return to Vienna, but Elisabeth had discovered that only in motion could she feel she was still alive. "Stop," she choked. It was during one of these trips that Elisabeth received the news that broke her heart forever. In 1867, his eldest daughter, Sophie, died at the age of 2 during a trip to Hungary. Elisabeth was not present. Once again, protocol had separated from her own daughter. The guilt she felt was devastating. Elisabeth came to believe that her constant absence had somehow caused her daughter's death. From that moment on, she dressed exclusively in black for years, as if she was forever mourning not only for her daughter, but for her own lost life. The relationship with Franz Joseph irreversibly deteriorated. He continued to love her with the same possessive intensity as always, but Elisabeth had become estranged in her own marriage. They barely spoke. When they were in the same room, Elisabeth seemed to be looking through him, as if he were made of glass. Franz Joseph tried to regain her with gifts, jewelry, palaces, trips, but Elisabeth had understood that her husband loved her as she loves a beautiful object, intensely but without true understanding. Elisabeth's emotional isolation was reflected in her appearance. She began to wear veils constantly, hiding the face of the world. When he needed to appear in public, he held fans or flowers in front of his face, as if his own image embarrassed her. The woman who had been considered the most beautiful in Europe was hiding from her own beauty, as if she were a curse she couldn't break. The coronation as Queen of Hungary in 1867 should have been Elisabeth's moment of triumph. She had fallen in love with Hungarian culture, had learned the language fluently, had developed a genuine identification with a people who, like her, felt overwhelmed by the Austrian Empire. The coronation in Budapest was a magnificent spectacle. Elisabeth wore a silver-embroidered white dress and the historic crown of St. Stephen. For a few hours, she seemed genuinely happy. But even this moment of joy was poisoned by the protocol. Elisabeth found that being a queen of Hungary meant only adding more obligations to an already suffocating life. She needed to appear in more ceremonies, greet more dignitaries, smile on more official occasions. The Hungarian crown, which should have been its release, became just another golden prison. The birth of his fourth and last daughter, Marie Valerie, in 1868, offered Elisabeth a last glimpse of maternal happiness. This time, she managed to keep her daughter close to her, protecting her from the clutches of the Archduchess Sophie. Elizabeth devoted Marie Valerie an almost obsessive love, as if all the motherhood that had been denied her with the other children could be compensated through this only child. But even this love was toxic. Elizabeth turned Marie Valerie into an extension of herself, a living doll that should realize all the dreams she had been prevented from achieving. The 1870s saw Elizabeth turn into a shadow of herself. She was still one of the most photographed women in Europe, but she insisted that only profiles were taken. She couldn't stand more than her face was completely visible. Her official portraits showed an etheric beauty woman, almost ghostly. Elizabeth seemed to be dissolving before the eyes of the world, keeping only the contours of her ancient glory. Elizabeth's daily routine had become a self-affiliation ritual. She woke up before dawn and spent 2 hours exercising. He took a cold shower, massaged with imported oils, and then the 3-hour process began to comb his hair. I ate a microscopic meal, perhaps some strawberries, a raw egg, a glass of milk. He walked for 6 hours, regardless of the weather. At night, I applied facial masks and read poetry until I fell asleep. It was a life of monastic discipline, dedicated entirely to the preservation of a beauty that it was killing itself. In 1889, Elizabeth suffered the final blow. His son, Rudolf, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was found dead in Meierling, along with his lover, Maria Vitsera. Double suicide, because it was about, although the court tried to hide, destroyed Elizabeth in a way that not even years of unhappiness had achieved. Rudolf was only 30 years old. Elizabeth knew that her son had inherited from her the inability to live within the limitations imposed by imperial life. Rudolf's death was also Elizabeth's spiritual death. She started to dress exclusively in black. Not just dresses, but also the jewelry, the fan, even the horses she mounted needed to be black. Elizabeth turned into a perpetual widow, bereaved not only for her son, but for a whole life that could have been different. She barely spoke. When he did it, it was only to give orders or answer direct questions. The laughs, which were already rare, disappeared completely. Franz Joseph tried to solid it, but Elizabeth had closed in a world where he couldn't enter. She started traveling even more compulsively, as if constant movement could somehow leave pain behind. He visited Greece, where he had a palace built in Corfu. He traveled to England, where he rode horses with an intensity that even alarmed the English knights. I was going to Ireland, France, Switzerland, always running away, always in motion, always carrying the pain he could not abandon. Elizabeth's beauty, who at the age of 50 was still remarkable, acquired a ghostly quality. She looked like a queen of the dead, majestic but terrible. His eyes, which had once been compared to sapphires, became empty as wells. She walked as if floating slightly above the floor. The people who found her were disturbed. There was something in the Empress that suggested that she no longer belonged completely to the world of the living. The relationship with Marie Valerie, her youngest daughter, became the only genuine emotional connection that Elizabeth had. But it was a suffocating connection. Elizabeth placed in her daughter all her unfulfilled expectations, all her frustrated dreams. Marie Valerie was crushed by the weight of maternal love that was actually a form of possession. She loved her mother, but also feared her, instinctively realizing that Elizabeth was trying to live through her. The last years of Elizabeth's life had been marked by rapid deterioration. She had lost weight to such a point that her clothes had to be constantly adjusted. Her hair, still long, thick, was now the only thing left of her ancient glory. She continued to take care of them obsessively, as if they were the last connection with the young woman who had once been. Elizabeth developed a growing aversion to mirrors. She covered them or removed them from the rooms where she was. When he needed to look, he did it quickly, as who looks at something too painful to be supported. The woman who had once been considered the most beautiful in Europe could no longer tolerate her own image. It was as if she knew she had won her war against her own body, but the victory had been devastatingly expensive. The trips had become even more frantic. Elizabeth changed her destination without notice, as if trying to escape herself. She traveled with false identities, registering in hotels like Hohenem's Countess, or simply as a Hungarian lady. He was an empress on his own imperial condition, a woman trying to disappear from a life she had never truly chosen to live. In September 1898, Elizabeth was in Geneva, once again trying to escape. This time Franz Joseph, who planned to visit her in terre-à-tête. She had rented unknowingly a villa on the lakeside, but even this temporary refuge didn't bring her peace. Elizabeth walked along the banks of Lake Leman as a soulful soul, observing the dark waters that reflected the Alpine mountains. It was as if she were looking for something in the depths of the lake, maybe courage, perhaps forgetfulness. On the morning of September 10th, 1898, Elizabeth left the Beau Rivage Hotel to take the steam that would take her to Montreux. She wore a simple black dress and carried a parasol. Its waist still mediates the same 50 centimeters as always. At the age of 60, she kept the upright posture and the firm step of a young woman. But there was something in his movements that suggested haste, not the hurry of those who are late, but the hurry of those who finally decided on something important. Luigi Luciani expected in Geneva's peer as they expected so many anonymous admirers of Elisabeth over the years. But Luciani was not an admirer. He was an Italian anarchist of 25, who had decided to kill a figure of European royalty. It didn't matter which one. Elisabeth simply was unlucky to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps, in a darker interpretation, in the right place at the right time. As Luciani approached Elisabeth and her lady of company, Countess Stey, he raised his hand as if to greet her. Instead, it dug a sharp metal lime in the Empress's chest. The instrument was so thin that Elisabeth initially did not realize what had happened. She staggered slightly, but managed to keep walking to the steam. It was only when he tried to climb the board that collapsed. Elisabeth was loaded back to the hotel, where she died an hour later. The lime had pierced her heart, but death was slow. During her last moments, she murmured only one word: "What happened to me?" It was a question that summed up not only that fatal moment, but a whole life of perplexity in the face of a destination that had never fully understood. The irony was devastating. Elisabeth had spent a lifetime trying to appear. Of its imperial obligations, its decorative object condition, a marriage that stifled it, a protocol that transformed it into a prisoner. In the end, she disappeared as suddenly and violently as possible by the hands of a stranger who killed her not for who she was, but simply for what she represented. Franz Joseph received the news in Schönbrunn. The man who had loved Elisabeth with a possessive intensity for 44 years of marriage finally was alone with his obsession. He preserved Elisabeth's quarters just as she had left them, turning them into a kind of sanctuary. Her hair, cut after death, was stored in a golden box. Her clothes remained in the cabinets as textile ghosts of a woman who had become a ghost long before she died. Elisabeth's death revealed something terrible about the nature of female beauty in the 19th century, and perhaps in every century's. She had been worshipped, desired, photographed, and painted not by her intelligence, her courage, or her individuality, but for her ability to embody an impossible aesthetic ideal. Elisabeth understood that she was a prisoner of her own beauty and tried to escape through her only way of control, the systematic destruction of her own body. His war against herself was also a war against the expectations of a society that transformed women into decorative objects. Elisabeth developed anorexia nervus at a time when the disease had no name, but its symptoms were unmistakable: obsession with thinness, compulsive exercise, obsessive body measurement, refusal to eat. She was one of the first public women showing that the search for physical perfection can be a sophisticated form of suicide. Elisabeth's legacy resonates over the centuries as a broken mirror that still reflects fragments of uncomfortable truths. How many women continue to crash the same war against their own body? How many still measure their value through waist circumference or reflex in the mirror? How many find out that beauty, instead of liberation, can become the cruel of prisons? Elisabeth died in 1898, but her story is still written every time a woman looks in the mirror and sees an enemy to be defeated. Every time someone confuses body control with vital control. Every time beauty becomes not a gift, but a curse that devours from the inside out. The empress who wanted to disappear finally got her goal, but found that disappearing from an unfortunate life is different from finding a life that is worth living. Elisabeth won her liberation through death, but paid the highest possible price for a victory she could not enjoy. In the end, it remains a silent reminder that not all crowns are made of gold. Some are woven with their own hair, heavy as chains, and can only be removed when there is no more head to carry them.